Elena had never seen the library this empty. She was a late-night regular, working on her thesis in the small hours, but tonight, it felt different. The silence was heavier, the air cooler. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights had disappeared, leaving only the sound of her own breathing echoing through the cavernous room. She was buried in her notes at a desk in the old history wing, surrounded by dusty tomes and forgotten manuscripts. A single book lay open in front of her, a century-old collection on ancient folklore and legends. And despite her exhaustion, Elena couldn't pull herself away. As she flipped a page, the room's dim lighting flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement, a figure slipping silently between the shelves in the back corner of the room. "Hello?" she called, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. No response. She squinted, peering into the darkness. The figure had vanished, but the air felt colder, as if someone, or something, was still there, watching. Brushing it off as fatigue, Elena returned to her book, but the atmosphere grew thicker with each passing minute, the shadows closing in around her. Suddenly, a whisper drifted through the library, faint and urgent. "Elena." Her heart skipped. She hadn't told anyone she was here. No one should know. She glanced around, but the rows of books loomed silently back, indifferent. She decided to ignore it, assuming it was a trick of her tired mind. But then she heard it again, closer this time, echoing through the aisles. "Elena, come." Compelled by some unnameable urge, she rose from her seat, leaving her notes behind. She moved toward the voice, each step resonating on the old wooden floors. The library seemed to shift around her as she walked, the aisles bending and twisting, the walls narrowing, the shelves impossibly tall. She reached the farthest corner of the library, a forgotten section covered in dust and shadow. In the very back, she found a small, worn leather book lying on an empty shelf. Its title was faded, barely legible. She opened it, her fingers trembling as she flipped to the first page. But instead of text, the book held blank, endless pages, empty, save for a faint, inked outline of a figure, tall and slender, standing at the edge of a vast library. As she stared, the outline began to shift, details forming before her eyes. The figure took on features, clothes, a face, one she recognized all too well. It was her. Panicked, she tried to shut the book, but it wouldn't close. Her reflection in the outline looked back, wide-eyed, almost pleading. The words at the top of the page shifted, forming a single sentence in dark, ominous ink. The shadows around her deepened, swallowing the aisle, wrapping her in their cold, ink-black embrace. She tried to step back, to flee, but her legs refused to move. Her fingers were locked to the book, her image merging with the page, becoming part of the inked outline, absorbing her into the story. As her vision blurred, she saw her own face in the book's pages, her mouth open in a silent scream. And then, everything went dark. When the librarian arrived in the morning, Elena's notes were still scattered on her desk, her coat draped over the chair. But she was nowhere to be found. To this day, her research remains untouched, and in the forgotten corner of the library, a small leather book sits, waiting. On its cover, her face is faintly visible, a trapped reflection, forever bound within its pages. And on quiet nights, if one listens closely, her whispers fill the aisles, calling, waiting for someone else to follow her into the library's depths. Bobby had always been fascinated by old libraries, the kind with narrow corridors and towering shelves packed with stories long forgotten. When he arrived at the small town's library, one rumored to hold rare, nearly lost volumes, he couldn't resist sneaking in for a quick look, even though the sign on the door read, "Closed for renovation." The building was ancient, with tall, arched windows and dust swirling in every beam of dim light. Inside, it smelled of leather and mildew, of age and memory. The main reading room was dark, the lamps turned off, and as he made his way down a corridor, he realized he was utterly alone. He wandered deeper, skimming the spines of old books. But then, near the back of the library, he found something peculiar, a short, narrow aisle that seemed to appear out of nowhere. He didn't remember seeing it when he'd first entered. The sign hanging above it read, "Restricted Section." His curiosity piqued. Ravi stepped into the aisle. Unlike the rest of the library, this section was densely packed with dusty, leather-bound volumes. And as he walked further in, he noticed the temperature drop. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and a feeling crept over him, as if someone was watching him from the shadows. Suddenly, a rustling echoed from the end of the aisle, followed by a whisper, a faint, almost inaudible sound. He froze, his breath catching, his senses heightened. "Who's there?" he called, his voice swallowed by the walls of books. Silence. Then the whisper came again, closer this time. It was a single word, one that made his blood run cold. "Ravi." His heart pounded. He hadn't told anyone he was here, and the library was supposed to be empty. Forcing himself to calm down, he took a deep breath, then walked further down the aisle, the shelves seeming to stretch on indefinitely. Shadows curled around him, and every step echoed in the unnatural silence. At the end of the aisle, he spotted an old wooden chair and a small, empty desk, an odd setup for a place that hadn't been used in years. On the desk lay a single book, its cover tattered and worn. There was no title, only a faded emblem that looked like an eye, half hidden in shadow. He reached for the book, his fingers grazing its brittle pages, but as he opened it, his heart sank. The book was blank. Every single page was empty, untouched. Then, as if triggered by his touch, writing began to appear on the first page, ink bleeding into the paper. The words formed slowly, deliberately, as if written by an unseen hand. He came seeking answers, only to find himself lost in his own story. A chill ran down his spine. He slammed the book shut, but as he turned to leave, he found the aisle wasn't there anymore. The shelves had shifted, enclosing him in a tight corridor. The exit was gone. Panic clawed at him as he tried to navigate his way out, but the shelves stretched endlessly, like a maze that kept pulling him deeper into its grip. The whispers grew louder, closer, a chorus of voices calling his name. "Ravi, you sought the unknown." Desperately he ran, his footsteps echoing through the endless maze of books. But no matter how far he went, he always found himself returning to that same small desk, with the same empty book waiting for him. And then he saw something in the shadows, a figure watching him, tall and thin, its face obscured but its eyes glinting with an unnatural light. The figure raised a hand pointing at the book, its mouth twisting into an unreadable expression. Compelled by something he couldn't understand, Ravi picked up the book one more time, turning to a new page. This time, there were words scrawled in a frenzied, messy script. Each who reads the book must take his turn. As he read the final line, he felt his body freeze, his own reflection in the book staring back at him, slowly fading into the pages. His limbs turned heavy, his vision darkened, and he felt himself sinking into the book, becoming part of the ink, part of the words, part of the library itself. When the librarian arrived the next morning, the restricted section was empty, save for a single book on the desk. No sign of Ravi was ever found, and few knew he'd ever visited. But late at night, when the library is empty, some say you can still hear faint whispers calling his name. And those who dare to enter the restricted section might find the book on the desk, a new name etched into its blank pages, waiting for the next reader to come seeking answers, and finding something far more chilling. Henry wasn't much of a reader, but tonight he'd felt a strange pull toward the library. The old building loomed against the night sky, its stone facade weathered and cracked. He'd never been there after hours, but the library's doors had been mysteriously unlocked, practically inviting him in. He stepped inside, breathing in the familiar musty scent of ancient pages. Dim lights flickered above him, casting shadows on the bookshelves that stretched up to the vaulted ceiling. Everything was silent, too silent. Henry's footsteps echoed as he walked between the towering rows of books, rows that seemed longer and taller than he remembered. He reached the center of the library, where a massive, dust-covered tome lay open on a pedestal. The pages looked brittle, like they hadn't been touched in decades. Written in flowing, old-fashioned script were the words, "Something in him wanted to turn away, but he was transfixed." His fingers brushed the page, and instantly the temperature dropped. A gust of cold air swept past him, rattling the shelves, and a whisper, faint and chilling, filled his ears. Whisper, "Vo." Henry. He froze. He was certain no one else was in the library, but he couldn't deny the voice. It was soft and familiar, almost like an echo from a dream. He looked around, his heart racing, but the library was empty. Only the sound of his own breathing broke the stillness. Curiosity, or perhaps something darker, drove him to keep reading. The page in front of him was blank, save for a single line at the top, his full name, written clearly, unmistakably, as if the book had been waiting for him all along. Henry. How? The whispers grew louder, a low murmur filling the air, as the words began to form on the page beneath his name. They described his life with eerie accuracy, his struggles, his dreams, his regrets. Every memory he'd hidden, every secret he'd buried was now scrawled in black ink across the page. The story continued, revealing things he hadn't done, events he hadn't lived through. It described him growing older, filled with an overwhelming sense of loneliness. He tried to tear his eyes away, but he couldn't. His own life was unfolding on the pages before him, trapping him in its words. Desperately, he turned the page, hoping to find an end to this nightmare. But the next page was blank, and so was the one after that. As he kept flipping, he realized that the story continued only on the left pages, while the right side remained blank, save for one line at the top. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with voices, each more desperate and pleading than the last. "Help me. Don't leave. Stay with us." He slammed the book shut, the whispers instantly silenced. The library was quiet again, but he could feel the eyes of unseen figures watching him, waiting. He knew now that this was no ordinary book. It held not only his story, but the stories of countless others trapped within its pages, bound forever to the library. With trembling hands, he tried to back away, but he felt something holding him in place, a cold, invisible force that wouldn't let him leave. He looked down and saw that the book had reopened on its own, his name still written in bold letters. The words on the page shimmered, twisting into a new line. Henry's pulse quickened as he realized what the book wanted from him. He was bound to the library now, a new character in its endless collection. And soon, others would come, drawn by the whispers, pulled into its grasp. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The library's shelves closed in around him, wrapping him in darkness. Somewhere deep within the rows, the voices began again, faintly echoing, waiting for the next curious soul to wander in. And as the last flicker of light faded, his voice joined the chorus of whispers, bound forever to the library and its endless stories.